Good evening and welcome to Tessitet, the opera festival at the Cockpit Theatre live on Cockpit Broadcasting. We've come to the end of our live performances now, but we still have quite a few of these broadcasts to go, including 4 of live performances from last week, of which this is the first. And this is Her War by Edwin Roxburgh and Jonathan Ruffle. And it's a piece in development. It's a short piece that is hopefully going to grow, possibly with your help. We have a low ticket price for these broadcasts because we thought you should pay what you think it's worth. And if you want to do that, if you want to top up your £1, then there's a link, easydonate.org/herwar, which will make that very easy for you to do. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. There's a few more things to say about this. That the interactivity of this broadcast is that after we've seen the film of the performance, you're very warmly invited to type questions into the chat, which I will distribute out to the panel. So there's a lot to talk about with this piece. It's a beautifully researched, very meticulously put together piece with a huge amount of work in it, even though it's very, very short as yet. The next thing to say is that just as we ran the only pilot performance for opera with the DCMS, we're now repeating the process with the Paul Hamlin Foundation on a bigger scale, in investigating how theatre altogether can return to performance. To that end, we'll have a questionnaire sent to you after this, and even though you're online, it would be really helpful if you send that back, and helpful to all of us trying to reopen the sector. Specifically about Her War, with this piece, the audience act as members of a tribunal panel reviewing Joan Grace's case. Well, you'll see what she was instantly, but she is making appeal to appear before a tribunal for disability payment after the terrible ill effects of her work as a nurse in the First World War. There should be a link appearing in your chat, or it will do later, where there's a Google form where you can complete during or just after the performance to voice your decision as part of this tribunal judging her appeal. I hope that's not too complicated. Probably all will become apparent in the form. Anyway, enough from me. Let us take a look at Her War.
successful claims will have shown to the satisfaction of this office that your disability was caused or made worse by your Great War service? Answers, please.
You we have our wonderful librettist, Jonathan Ruffle, and Denise Pointer, the researcher whose work largely inspired her award, here to do a quick Q&A. So we need to just clear the stage. So stay put, stay where you are. Please do ask questions. Keep your masks on when you do it. Project, give us your very best Shakespearean voices. And so just give us a moment to clear the stage. So first of all, if we may, I'd love to just get the reactions from Jonathan and Denise, because you've never seen this before. Well, nobody has, except for Will. And then we'll open it up to the floor.
Denise.
Do I need to keep this on? Because I just want to I don't think you do.
No, you're all right, because that's why we kept the distance.
Okay. Yes, you can slip it up.
I was just saying to my daughter, actually, I was finding it really emotional because it's the first time I've seen it. And actually, you and I, we spoke a little while ago, and I could see all the things that we spoke about, and you know what happened to me before, and then just seeing that there, it kind of, gosh, yeah, it just brought a lot up for me, you know, yeah, really emotional. So, yeah, I'll go to somebody else for a minute while I just get this.
Well, the thing I thought was just completely brilliant about it was the very first and most striking thing we ever spoke about this was the way that First World War paperwork, which I've seen far too much of over the years, is always very neatly filled out. It was within boundaries, within the boxes, and on the lines. And reading these particular appeals by this particular group of women and the injustice they were facing, they burst out of the boxes on the paper. And I just that whole image was so present. I felt that the voice and trumpet were trying to tear out of the injustice of the situation. And it was very, very powerful. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. When I think I definitely felt like your libretto, based on this document, which we first came across in Denise's research, which was kind of some of the first of its kind on women and shell shock, was sort of a thing that jumped out and kind of grabbed us all by the throat, I think. But I think that when we got the document that she'd written, we thought, blimey, okay, this gives us kind of everything that we need to. And then Edwin Roxburgh, the composer, came along and just thought, I know what I can do with this. And so I can't speak for the rest of you, but I just sort of felt like when I was given the score, I was like, yeah, he's pretty much told us what we need to do. And we were sort of given most of what we needed. And even like when we were staging it, a lot of things just kind of came easily to mind. But does anyone have any questions?
Well, I do, yeah, but I'm slightly anxious. I mangled my introduction, but do you not have a question for all of us about the tribunal?
We do. We thought we might do this at the end of the
okay.
Q&A.
Okay.
We might. So yes, we do have a question for you all.
Do you know what? I've got a question for you, the audience, then, actually. So I'm really curious about this. As you saw in that performance, the composer Edwin has put a variety of mutes in the trumpet. And there's one section in the middle where you take the mute out entirely, and the trumpet's very loud, very suddenly. In this space, how loud was it? Was it sort of too overwhelming, or was it sort of bearable? I'm always curious about how the trumpet carries in acoustics.
I actually found it quite uncomfortable. I have rather dodgy ears anyway.
Okay.
And I did have to block one of them.
That's good to know. It was loud. Okay. Well, it was I guess it was for a limited time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was perfectly manageable. I just blocked the ear that was
that's very helpful.
Finding it comfortable.
Yeah.
I mean, I have very differing hearing frequencies in my ears, so I'm used to hearing things rather oddly and some things are less comfortable.
No, that's really helpful, actually. I'll communicate that back.
Thank you.
One of the things, oh, sorry, yes, please.
What are the challenges of just singing with a trumpet? I mean, you presumably haven't done many duets with just a trumpet.
Not with just a trumpet. I have done a fair amount of work with just a single instrument, with violin, for instance, with clarinet, with oboe, and with cello. But trumpet is different again. I think the balance is one of the questions, but I think Edmund wrote it really well. He threw me a lot of bones as a singer, kind of gave me my note and a lot of things to hold on to. So I think he made my job easier in that way. And so one of the things we're going to pick up on in the digital broadcast, where Edmund will be joining us as part of the panel, is how he did that and kind of picked up on the psychology that Jonathan had written in, and then to kind of turn that into a whole drama with two people. So it's a two-hander, but with notes. But so what was it like for you as the audience, just having those two instruments? Did it give you everything that you felt you needed from the drama? I'm seeing some nods.
It was effective. It was definitely very effective.
What's interesting for me is that they're working in quite similar pitch areas.
Yeah.
So sometimes it actually does make it a little difficult to hear text. Partly because there's not a great differential of, with a lower instrument, the instrument was not so much in your range, you'd have perhaps found it easier as a listener to distinguish. But they do, they go together very well, the voice and the trumpet. But I think certainly for words it's a challenge.
The texture's very relentless, isn't it? It's very relentless. So
is her situation.
Well, yes, quite.
This is the thing. We get to go home at the end of the night. If you're living with this condition, you don't. Especially when you're kind of stuck in that aspect of trauma. And that was something that I suppose I wanted to just maybe ask Denise if she would just draw out quickly again. It was just this idea that we were trying with this project to make a sort of trauma-informed process, so that we would kind of be more aware of what PTSD is actually like in the mind and the body, and try and sort of think, if we're trying to portray it realistically, we've got to understand. And Denise, would you be willing to just give us a very brief definition of what trauma is?
Funnily enough, I was just going to ask you a question, because I saw beautifully what we talked about and how you were saying there might be moments of how to express that trauma in her through voice and singing. But I think that was what got me emotional, because I could see it coming out, and that was really moving for me. And this is just a very small point, because there was no PTSD in the First World War. It was shell shock, and of course, as a woman having shell shock, when it was something that was very masculine, there would have been a lot more probably suppression on Jane's part in terms of how she wanted to, or how she was able to express herself. And probably a lot of what made that worse was the fact that she had to keep pushing it down. Because with any kind of trauma, the more you push it down, the worse it is. So, but yeah, because the nurses were expected to almost be braver than the men, if you like, because they didn't have the trenches to seek shelter from, which is something we forget about. We always think about the trenches as being the worst thing about the First World War, when actually they did give you some cover, whereas the nurses were out on open ground and being bombed and shelled in hospitals and casualty clearing stations that had to keep moving because they were so close to where the shelling was. So they didn't have an awful lot of protection. And because they were expected to nurse the men and get them back in the front line, they couldn't be seen to be weak and actually going off duty because they were sick. So they had to hold a lot of it together. And a lot of it did come out after the war, but that made it almost doubly difficult, because people were saying, well, what's the problem now? And they had, I think they had a double, much more of a not double, but they had it much worse. that sounds awful to say, because I know the soldiers had a really bad time, or a lot of them did, but the nurses had to keep pushing that down. So.
And from what you were telling me, you know, a potted definition of trauma is just when the organism is overwhelmed, and normally
Yes,
we'd be able to kind of release that. And something I was learning about was just that normally it would be through shaking. That's what creatures usually do, mammals usually do, to just get rid of all the built up chemicals, you know, so either for the fight and flight or just for the freeze and fold. So you're either mobilizing to, you know, to fight or playing dead. And that in PTSD, you kind of get, or in trauma, you get caught in one of those states where you're cycling between them. Mm-hmm. And so, which aspects of that did you actually see come out in what we were doing?
Me?
Or you? Yeah.
Sorry. I saw the trembling, I saw the trauma, but I also saw a lot of the other emotions, because we forget when there's trauma, there's a lot of anger sometimes comes out, a lot of sadness, a lot of shame, and there was moments where, again, like you hear the noises as came over there, that automatic reaction, which we commonly see in soldiers, that's the story. But we forget about some of the other things, like the silence and the withdrawing and the going into yourself, and that stare, that very distance, that disconnect that sometimes happens, and that all those came out. And they say we think it's just fear, but there's an awful lot of other emotions that come with it. So, and I saw all of those, which is I got quite emotional.
And for you guys, do you feel like did it make it a richer journey for you, or does knowing what kind of fed into this, does that actually make more sense of what you saw?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that came out very strongly in the drama actually was almost as if the trumpet was in your head, that, you know, you were the same person, that the trumpet was somehow expressing the trauma as well, but having these extra insights was really useful to me, so yeah, thank you for that.
That was absolutely the idea, actually. With the different positions, when I was standing back here, I was more of a figure of authority, a bureaucratic figure. Then moving forwards, then it becomes more sympathetic, or some kind of amplification or representation of what.
Could you talk through the idea of the mute, which was the thing and the offering of the pen? Could you talk us through those ideas? What was your thinking there?
Yeah. I mean, this sort of emerged in the staging, and I think. The first time, it became the nurse's hand that I was just seeing suddenly in my hand, and kind of reacting to that particular stimulus. But then, you know, so it sort of becomes the representation for all the things that have happened to her, and not being believed, which I think is almost another trauma of its own. And so it sort of represented all, you know, all the people who want to silence you and who don't want to believe what you have to say. And so then I think, and then so the second time when he sort of hands, it's just this sense of, I've just told you what happened to me, and it's almost the nonchalantness of, yeah, get on with it, fill in the form, and the sense of like, I can't do, you know, my hand isn't gripping, I can't do the normal stuff. But yeah, so it was kind of thinking, what can we do with very few props? But and the symbolism, we just thought this makes so much sense. So just, I think we can all sympathize with the idea of someone who's tried to silence us, you know, at some degree, at some time in our lives. And I just think for someone who's suffered this kind of thing, just the rage at the felt injustice of that. But good to know that you thought it worked.
Yeah. I think so. The idea initially came because, you know, as you could see with the trumpet, to try to create some kind of variation in the sound, I cycled through some different mutes. And actually, when you're changing from one mute to another, if there's nothing else really going on, it is a bit sort of still. It does slow things down. So we tried to think of ways to use that space. And one idea we had was that actually the first mute I had, the shape of it isn't a million miles away from the head of a grenade or something. And at one point we even thought about, you know, painting it or something, you know, giving it a more explicit thing. We left that one behind, but I think the idea was that actually the passing of these objects was in some way triggering, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that brought on some of your symptoms, because another conversation we had was that with this particular condition, if I'm right, it's not obvious all the time on the surface, but there'll be certain things that happen where it sort of all comes out, and actually we thought that the mute might be one of those sorts of moments.
Because there's oftentimes the appearance of normality until something triggers. Brilliant. We are running out of time, so just a final question.
Yeah, okay, so as you're aware, this is an R&D performance, and we're really keen to get your feedback, particularly on how successful this was at delivering a certain kind of message that we wanted to deliver. So, based on what you heard, a say of I, who thought that this particular case of the claimant should progress to the tribunal?
Aye.
Also,
Aye.
So the message has got through.
I'm going to say nay, just to represent the historical reality, of course, of what happened.
Is that what happened?
We're all doing it.
Is that what happened? She was denied, or they were denied?
Well, this particular woman's claim, from what you were saying, she had made multiple appeals. And so she was actually writing quite a few years after the war, and she's like, I never received compensation, I have never received anything. And I think that's one of the reasons why she's mad as a hornet. So it's that was often historical reality. Brilliant. We need to leave you, but thank you so much for joining us. Please do fill out the form. Be as generous, as long-winded in your feedback as you'd like. It will help us all. Thank you so much for your time, for braving public transport, and for joining us tonight. It has been wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh wow, it's so great to hear the applause of an audience that's just watched a show in a live space. It's an extraordinary thing. I miss it already as we finished on Sunday. The thing I've said before every performance and every broadcast, and which interestingly slipped my mind before this one, is how every single artist in the festival has been turned upside down and inside out by the COVID crisis. That we had a whole pile of shows ready to go in. I could have programmed this in December really, but come March we were all shaken up, and it's something to bear in mind when you see that each company of artists has had to completely rethink their shows again and again and again and again. I'm guessing I didn't say that before this because it was, I imagine, pretty near what the artists wanted to make, and also because maybe it wasn't that affected. I don't know, that's a question we might be able to ask the artists in a moment, but it's certainly a good thing to think about when we ask for a donation. Just think what they've been through and where they're heading. To do that, you go to easydonate.org, her war. But let's ask them all to come back in now, rejoin the room, our panel. And I'd love to go first to April and tell us about the donations.
Yes, we would love to be able to make the rest of the work. This was a projected first part of potentially 3 or 4. And this is obviously a very intense initial offering to really get us into the world of the artist. But we'd love to be able to explore more of her journey and maybe some of the more everyday aspects of her reality as well. But primarily, we want to be able to just fund the creation of the rest of the work, plus engagement work. So not only with some ex-servicemen and women, but also with ideally refugees and anyone who has been experiencing traumas, also nurses who are either in military contexts or because of the recent COVID crisis are experiencing PTSD. We want to be able to fund the work to just use this as a prompt to be able to help them talk about their experience and it would just be wonderful to just be able to bring it through to its full completion, to bring people on the entirety of that journey. So it would be lovely to.
Yeah, well, there you are. Send April thousands of pounds for easydonate.org her war. Now, let's get going with the questions. To remind the audience, you're very welcome to tap any question you like into the chat room and I will pass it on. But I think I'd love to come straight back to you again, April. You came to me, I think, 2 years ago, possibly more, with this piece. And it's something that clearly you really wanted to do. I'd love to know where it came from. What was the driver that got this all going?
Well, I think, first of all, it had to be my master's and my doctorate on Ivor Gurney that got me interested in the whole question of the effect of the trenches on people. And then working with Simon, we kind of came up with the idea over a drink at the Barbican one day and thought, hey, this is a mad idea. What would it be like to do an opera for just these two instruments? And thinking about all the connotations in the mind that the trumpet evokes, and thinking, you know, we are both performing researchers, and thinking this would be quite an interesting project. And then we wanted someone who was really suffused in the subject matter. And so I approached some of the writers who'd been working on the centenary radio dramas, and Jonathan Ruffell was one of the first to come back to me and said, do you know, people have talked a lot about the experience of the men, but no one is talking about the experience of the women. What if we work on that? That is the project that really interests me. And he had himself become interested in this through the work of Denise Pointer. So that is the sort of link that brought us in. And I think the more that we started interacting with the source documents, with the actual experience of these women as caught in the pension claim forms, I think we were all just pretty arrested by that journey. And Simon had worked with Edwin before, and not only on a piece about World War I, Pro Patria, but also just in different contexts for the trumpet. But we also knew that he'd written for solo instruments. And so this question of how you maintain a line, how you flesh out everything that's needed with just bare bones in terms of instruments, we figured he was the right man for the job, and turns out we were right. But that's sort of in the end how it came to be.
Well, that's fascinating. I'd never have expected that the first person to join you in the project would have been the orchestra, but it was really lovely to see how immersed you were in this, Simon, and how much interaction. Because I think outside opera people don't really realise that usually the singers and the director and the designer and everybody work together for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then the accompaniment, the orchestra, turns up in the last few days. And we've tried with tete-a-tete a lot to do a lot of integration, but it's very hard because you get much less rehearsal. So I'd love to know from you, Simon, how you became so motivated and put so much in. You're muted.
There we go.
That's it.
Thank you. So I think with opera there can be a bit of a sense of them and us. Like you say, between the orchestral musicians and everyone getting the stage, everyone involved in the production, and just to get a piece of that as an instrumentalist was really attractive to me. I've always wondered, what if we could get instrumentalists up there on the stage too to join the singers? It doesn't undermine anything that the singers do. It's just joining in the fun. And that motivated me a lot. If I'm honest with you, I hadn't visualized it. I was thinking a lot in this project about the dots, about the music, about the chance to play through a score in a duo with a soprano. And it was only towards the premiere that April came up with costumes. And then it became really real, and then I suddenly realized, oh, actually this is, I'm really, really involved in this. And actually I think in the final product, we are equal partners. in this production. And I feel like, on behalf of trumpet players, that's my achievement. Because I always want to leave behind. You know, you think about what you do for your love, and I just think to be able to leave behind this sort of a piece, you know, for other trumpet players to get the chance to do that is really motivating. I have to say it's my #1 motivating factor, actually, because there's nothing else like it. And I really think people are going to take this one on, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it's so obvious in this piece what a huge amount of work has gone into it. You can almost see it in this panel. It's a piece with 2 people. There are 6 of you that made it, and you're really like the initiators. It's very hard to know where to go from you, as it happened in such an odd order. But let's go to you, Jonathan. How did you come into the piece?
Well, I'd been a bit like April. I'd got form for doing World War One stuff because I'd been show running a 42-episode radio drama about the First World War. And, you know, we often hear this thing, don't we, about, you know, people being forgotten or unknown. Well, I think it's more aggressive than that. And this is something that Denise's work confirmed brilliantly, was the idea that in the post-First World War culture and subsequent to that, there was essentially, and she can correct me on my accuracy here, but I think I'm right in saying there was generally a direction that the culture, the country, and the men actually felt intensely guilty about what the women had experienced, and how close they'd come to the front, and how high the consequences had been for them. And and there's a similar story, by the way, with the British Indian Army. I deliberately set Tommy's in the British and Indian Army, because any military historian knows the massive contribution of the British Indian Army, but it has suited neither the British nor the Indian government to consistently tell that story over the last 100 years, indeed in the Second World War too. So it served no one's purpose, and it's gone. And I think, like a lot of people, you know, I hate things being hushed up, and that's a real spur. So when somebody wanted to go, I rather felt that I was pleased with the body of work I'd done about women in the First World War, and hinted at what was going to happen to them afterwards. But here now as a project to talk about them in that complete range. And then the idea of Denise's 1920 Pension Tribunals, you could see the arc, you know, extending out beyond the end of the First World War. And I'd used a lot of her work in characters who were suffering within the normal years, as you might call them, of the First World War. But here at last was a chance to go beyond that, and that was absolutely perfect. And one of the things that, you know, I'd like to sketch. I mean, you talked about if people punted up some more money, places that this could go. I mean, this I've always felt that what you've heard today is a quarter, roughly, in length of what I think we might be able to do here. And I think I'd love to explore the kind of person a little bit more that Joan was before. And also, I've tried my best to hint at it in this, but it wasn't really this part of the story, how much her own salvation lies in being heard as a person. And my own encounters with people in similar situations have been a lot to do with the fact that finally somebody actually listens to them, and they are able to articulate their pain, to a certain extent begin to own their problem. There's years of work to be done. And I think there's ways in which we might better show, even within the tribunal context, how Joan actually begins to find her own salvation and actually grows out of this experience in a sincere way, not for dramatic purposes, making her journey suggest short or you know, lacking in its own traumatic experiences, but we could actually hint at how people finding themselves in these situations might get themselves out of it. And the same thing, and the other thing that I'd love to bring in, and haven't got a clue, answer on a postcard, please. You know, the wide range of experiences. I jotted a few down. The radiographers working in Italy, women, the female code breakers in Paris who were working under the long range guns firing on Paris, the touring London shows that put Ypres and Albert on their schedule. They went over there and just went to the troops. I found a female assistant working in Lawrence of Arabia's Arab Bureau in Cairo. they've just all been erased. And even if we could hint at some connection with this, you know, basically we've been, I mean, it's great we're talking about the drivers, the cooks, the nurses and the female doctors. But I'd love to find ways in which we could suggest this vast range of involvement. You know, not the mud, the blood, the incessant poetry, as Blackadder so memorably put it.
Well, maybe this is a series of operas. I think let's ask Edwin now. The audience is beginning to see the huge amount of work and information and ideas that have gone into this piece. And I always rather agree with David Pountney. Opera is vulgar. It's not a place for ideas, it's a place for emotion. And I think your great achievement is all the ideas have got in there. But I'm not going to say you've been vulgar, but you've certainly transferred that all into a very powerful, raw, emotional thing. How was it doing that, and how was it for you? Oh, you're
Sure.
muted as well.
Oh, sorry.
That's right. Oh,
you turned yourself off, old boy.
Hi there. Oh,
Yeah.
good. Fine. Sorry. Yes, well, I'm very, very excited to actually take on the commission that was provided. And my immediate impression was it rather restates the issues that I've been involved in with quite a number of my pieces. Really, I mean, musicians and artists can't influence the way politicians make their decisions and the way wars are rise, but at least we can actually record our reaction to this for history. And I think the artistic product is always a more eloquent way of expressing what history is about. I feel that Jonathan actually captured the character of the nurse with intense emotional intensity, and I found myself really quite reeling with possible ideas that were surrounded. Obviously, it's not easy to write for to an instrument and a voice that are so different in their qualities. The trumpet being a very dominating instrument to some extent very often, and the voice could easily be drowned. So it was rather nice to try to find practical solutions as well as artistic ones to actually express the emotional content of each section of the libretto. And I found that using the various kinds of mutes that are capable of being used today was a very, very good way of actually altering the character of the music that I was writing in each of the sections to intensify the intense experience of the nurse herself. So my reaction to the invitation to write the music was immediate. Mainly because I knew Simon's trumpet playing, and indeed his intellectual capacity in his role at Hull University really made me feel that we had a very, very strong group of people to actually make a very, very important comment on what is happening, not only in what actually happened in the First World War with these poor women, but also it reflects something of what is still going on today.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to go over to Denise to ask, that you're clearly immersed in this history. And watching it just now, I'd noticed, which I hadn't before, how April, you mentioned it in your Q&A, there's a lot of hands and a lot of hand wringing. And at the moment where we've just gone through this, you know, happy birthday hand washing and this clapping for carers, it seems such a kind of powerful connection in a way. Somehow it's all like, is it something we do when we are upset or something? I don't know. But anyway, the bigger question for you, Denise, is how do you see what you discover in your research still around in the world today?
That's a really, really interesting question, because I was just going to pick up on something Jonathan just said about the guilt that the soldiers had towards the women because they weren't being heard. What we also have to remember is there was a huge amount of guilt on the part of the women because they were experiencing a condition that was very much portrayed as a masculine condition. So there's a whole body of work there, of which I only touched on in part of the work that I did, about the women trying to come to terms with the fact that they were having these symptoms, and they felt ashamed to have those symptoms because it was a masculine condition. So that started to come through. The other thing that Jonathan said was actually they just wanted, for a lot of them, they just wanted to have their voice heard. And it made me smile at that point because as working in the field that I'm in now, that is one of the things that is constantly drummed into us, is that actually most of the time you can support people by just listening and hearing them and properly hearing them and believing the experience. And that just had a resonance for me as Jonathan was saying it, that actually there are a lot of people that go through trauma now, and we have this kind of cultural attitude, don't we, sort of sit, shut up and put up and don't and get on with it, stiff up British, stiff upper lip kind of thing, and for a lot of people that makes that can contribute to it being worse. Coming back to what April said earlier about the COVID, it has, again, such resonances for me in that nurses in the First World War, to be a nurse, you actually go into that as a vocation or a career in order to help people get well. Of course, in the First World War, they were actually nursing them to go back to the front line, and all the risks that entailed. So that wouldn't have sat right with them, and that contributed to the trauma. And coming back to COVID now, yes, obviously a nurse has to deal with death, but not on the scale that we've just recently been seeing. So I actually predict and suspect that there will be a lot of post-traumatic stress cases coming forward from nurses and medical staff now, because it's something that it's beyond the pale. It's something they're not used to dealing with in that number. But the trauma, there's been a lot of work on trauma throughout the last many years, emanating from the First World War. Sadly, we don't learn an awful lot from history at times, and other times there's been huge leaps forward. So in essence, there's some things we've taken from the First World War and the Second World War and subsequent wars, and also there are things now that we think actually we haven't learned an awful lot. There might still be a lot of veterans who are trying to get their voices heard. So if anything from this comes about to help that, absolute thumbs up from me and everybody on the team. So.
Well, it really, really gets conversation going. Let's come to you, Matthew. You're our last person on, but of course not least. Tell us how you fitted in the whole production.
I'm a historical consultant, and I've worked on many projects which relate to this, especially Testament of Youth, which was a recent film about somebody in the very same position, Vera Brittain. And her experience was very similar to Joan's. She went through a great deal of trauma, witnessed shelling firsthand, saw friends of hers dying, and also witnessed the really gruesome injuries on a daily basis, but kept going. And picking up on something Denise said, that also ties in with today. A member of my family is a nurse, a very experienced nurse from Southern Africa, and she's dealt with, in her home in Southern Africa, mass deaths from TB and HIV/AIDS. And she was brought in to work in a COVID ward in Birmingham. And it was like walking towards machine guns on the 1st of July, 1916. Yeah. Because in the very same hospital, same ward as her, other nurses from Africa died from COVID. So she thought that she might die, but the chances are she would die just from the viral load. But she and her colleagues stuck to their guns, stuck to their beds, because they are such dedicated nurses. She made a will, she made arrangements for her family, but kept going in. And that's the trauma, that's what's going to bring out the PTSD, is knowing that you've got to keep on going, just as it did in the First World War. There's no running away. When you're going through hell, keep on going. And that's what she has done. So this story that we've experienced today in her war resonates both with what I've been sharing over the past few years of the lives of people in World War One, but also the lives of people today, and that's the most extraordinary coming together. And the way that this particular production is staged has come together perfectly for the circumstances we find ourselves in. Less is far, far more. Perhaps in another time this would have been done with an orchestra and a choir. But bringing it down to the minimum of one voice and one trumpet has enabled the essence that opera distills to become ever more powerful. And opera does that. It extracts the essence of a story, and in this case, the essence of an emotional experience, and transmits that in a way that beyond any other form of arts, whether visual or performance in any way. And
well, how great! We're out of time, I'm afraid. I've got this clocks flashing at me and kind of going, bleh. But that's a really lovely note to end on, Matthew, turning that round from the terribleness of trauma to the power of opera to help us address this. And this piece certainly starts conversation, as well as being really moving. You're all to be hugely congratulated, and look forward to the next bit. And if you want more, easydonate.org, her war. Anyway, thank you very much.